Hi there, welcome back to Homemaking Monday. I thought today we could talk about what Proverbs says about women in general, and not just Proverbs 31, because we all know that, although I will go over it. But I went ahead and I looked through the book of Proverbs in its entirety, and I just went through the different verses that mention not just women, but wives in specific. And I found it interesting, the first verse that Proverbs actually mentions about a wife is, it says in Proverbs 5:18, let your fountain be blessed and take pleasure in the wife of your youth. And of course, at this point, the writer is contrasting enjoying your marriage versus going off and committing adultery. But I found it interesting and something to kind of ponder that the first verse about a wife in Proverbs is about her giving pleasure to her husband. And I think that that is definitely one of our biggest ministries to our husband, is giving pleasure to them, not just obviously through our bodies and through intimacy, but just through life in general. I have found that the greatest joy to my husband is when he can make me laugh. And I tend to be a very serious person. I have to actively remind myself, like, you know what, let loose, laugh with your husband when he's being silly at 1 a.m., when he just got home from a crazy day at work. Laugh with him, enjoy it. So I found that interesting. That's the first one. And then if you contrast that, when you go across to Proverbs 7, verses 10 through 11, it says, a woman came to meet him dressed like a prostitute, having a hidden agenda. She is loud and defiant, and her feet do not stay at home. And I was thinking about that. She is loud and defiant. Her feet do not stay at home. And what a contrast to the submissive wife who is choosing to give pleasure to her husband, like we said, not just physically, but through having fun with him, through being an enjoyable person to be around, versus the one who is loud and defiant, pretty much the opposite of submission. So then moving right along, I found Proverbs 8, verses 6 through 9. And I found this interesting because, again, this isn't just a wife anymore now. This is wisdom, but being portrayed as a woman. And it says, this is what wisdom says. It says, she speaks, listen, for I speak of noble things, and what my lips say is right. For my mouth tells the truth, and wickedness is detestable to my lips. All the words of my mouth are righteous. None of them are deceptive or perverse. All of them are clear to the perceptive and right to those who discover knowledge. And obviously none of us will be able to obtain full and perfect wisdom in this life, but I love this as just a clear-cut list of things to strive for. A mouth that says what is right, it speaks the truth. Wickedness is detestable to those lips. The words of her mouth is righteous. None of them are deceptive or perverse. And they are clear to the perceptive and right to those who seek knowledge. They are intelligent. They are clear. They are understandable. But then if you contrast that with Proverbs 11, verse 16, and then also verse 22. But starting with verse 16, it says, a gracious woman gains honor, but a violent man gains only riches. And then if you go down to 22, a beautiful woman who rejects good sense is like a gold ring in a pig's snout. I found that interesting after reading what Proverbs says that wisdom speaks of, to then read that a beautiful woman who rejects good sense, or essentially rejects wisdom, it's just like a gold ring in a pig's snout. We can be beautiful, but if we're rejecting the wisdom that is taught to us by those older than us, by those who have done it before, by the Bible itself, then we're just a gold ring in a pig's snout. And who would want that? All right, then moving right along to Proverbs 14:1. Every wise woman builds her house, but a foolish one tears it down with her own hands. And if you think about that, he's not speaking, I don't think, very literally right now. I do think that he's speaking somewhat figuratively, because especially at this time when this was written, women were the homemakers. They were building their house. I think, obviously there was the physical side to that as well, but they were building their home. They were building the environment in which their children were raised, that their husband would come home to after a long day working. And she builds it. She sustains it. She cultivates it. And if you think about building, that's very deliberately. There are many different parts to it. But a foolish one tears it down with her own hands. And if you think about when you're tearing something down, are you being deliberate with it? Or are you just kind of, manically reaching, pulling stuff down, knocking stuff down, going about it kind of haphazardly? When you tear something down, you're not very, conscientious, shall we say, about, well, let me do this screw first and let me do this. No, you take a sledgehammer and you just go at it and you don't think about it. And again, if you contrast that with the woman of wisdom and how every word of her mouth is righteous and deliberate, and how a woman building her house is very careful, she's looking at all the unique parts and how to build it. What a contrast. And what kind of a woman do we want to be? And if we're not being submissive, if we're being loud and defiant, which one bears what fruit, do you think? I mean, obviously submission has to be with wisdom, right? Just because I submit to my husband doesn't mean that I don't use my voice. If I disagree with a decision that he's making, I'm not going to, stay silent about that. I will speak up. However, I'm not going to be loud and defiant and be like, but if you do this, then forget you. No, I'm going to state my case. This is why I think X, Y, Z. But ultimately, we have to remember that as women and as wives, we're not accounting to the Lord for our husband's decisions. We are accounting to the Lord for how we reacted to them. He does say in his scripture, wives, submit to your own husbands. That is a direct, clear cut. I am directly quoting scripture there. He doesn't say husbands submit to your wives. He says husband loves your wives. And that does entail listening to us. But ultimately, they will account to God for how they loved us and the decisions that they made in leadership. And we will account to God for how we submitted to them and how we respected them. So moving on, that was Proverbs 14. Let's look at Proverbs 15:17 as the next one. And I'll see if I can write this full list of verses down in the description, just so you can kind of go through them if you want. And also, after this, read just the individual verses for yourself and pray over them and see what the Lord tells you. But Proverbs 15:17. Better a meal of vegetables where there is love than a fattened ox with hatred. Proverbs 17:1. Better a dry crust with peace than a house full of feasting with strife. Proverbs 18:22. Let's see. I love this one. The man who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord. That's the kind of wife I would like to be. But then immediately again, there's this contrast if you go to Proverbs 19. And after this, there's actually a whole slew of verses like this that I'll be reading. But if you go to Proverbs now 19, verse 13, I'm sorry, there's our grandfather clock. I hope you can still hear me over it. But Proverbs 19:13 says, a foolish son is his father's ruin, and a wife's nagging is an endless dripping. A house and wealth are inherited from fathers, but a sensible wife is from the Lord. I would love to be that kind of a wife, a sensible wife. I don't want to be a nagging wife where I'm an endless dripping, or, he's eating this lush meal, but because I'm a nagging wife, he would rather be up on some sort of a rooftop. And again, you go down to Proverbs 21. Better to live on the corner of a roof than to share a house with a nagging wife. And then you go to, that was 21:9, I'm sorry, but if you go to Proverbs 21:19 then, it says better to live in a wilderness than with a nagging and hot-tempered wife. And I love that point about a hot-tempered wife, because if we go back again to the wife who either built her house or tears it down with her own hands, I feel like again it kind of shows that. To be tearing down your house with your own hands, that requires somewhat of a hot temper. Or at least that's what a hot temper would produce. All right, let's see here. Now we go to Proverbs 25, verse 24. Again, it's the exact same verse, but repeated several chapters later. 4 chapters later, the same verse is repeated. Better to live on the corner of a roof than to share a house with a nagging wife. And remember, these are the words that Samuel heard from his parents that he then wrote down for us. Or, I'm sorry, not Samuel, Solomon heard from his parents that then he wrote down. So the fact that this is repeated so much, it shows that it must have meant a lot to his parents to express this to him, of choose a good wife and then stick with her. Don't go having fun elsewhere, but then stick with your wife. But what a point that they continually say, verse after verse after verse, better to live on the corner of a roof in the wilderness than with a nagging wife. All right, now let's go to Proverbs 27, verses 15 through 16. An endless dripping on a rainy day and a nagging wife are alike. I'm going to pull this back because you can't hardly see me. There we go. Let me read that again. This is Proverbs 27, 15, and 16. An endless dripping on a rainy day and a nagging wife are alike. The one who controls her controls the wind and grasps oil with his right hand. Think about that. Think about a husband who's continually just trying to somehow, attach himself to his wife. Somehow, control is a strong word for today's society, but somehow connect with her. Think of it that way. Somehow connect with her, get on the same page with her, and it's like trying to grab oil. That's a nagging wife, it says. All right, let's go to Proverbs 30, verse 20. This is a contrast of the adulteress who, in general is just like an example of the moralless woman, the woman who is completely morally destitute. It says, this is the way of an adulteress. She eats and wipes her mouth and says, I've done nothing wrong. So that was Proverbs 30, verse 20, but then you jump right over to Proverbs 31, verse 10. And then that's the part that we all know so well. Proverbs 31, verses 10 through 31. And it's that just amazing description of the woman that really every Christian woman desires to be. That's why we all know it so well. But I find it interesting that those are all the verses that lead up to this amazing collection, this one chunk of 21 verses that is all just about the capable wife. And as far as I've seen, I could be wrong, please do correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the longest collection of Proverbs on the same topic that I see together in the book. Other ones, it'll be like 1 or 2 verses on this, 1 or 2 verses on that, and kind of staccato. But this is the biggest one that I've seen that's all the collection of just one. Next week we can unpack this a little bit more in Homemaking Monday. I'll go over this. And I like that with Homemaking Mondays, it seems like, we're kind of naturally taking a turn towards homemaking in the spiritual sense, at least for these 2 weeks. So join me again next Monday, and we'll unpack the rest of Proverbs 31, verses 10 through 31, and what that means. We'll kind of take it more verse by verse, the way that we did all the rest of Proverbs today. I hope you have a wonderful and blessed rest of your week. And please do remember to like, comment, subscribe. It really does mean a lot. And I will see you next time.